In August of 1944, an American Army officer stood in front of what remained of his unit, a force that had numbered nearly 3,000 men when it marched into Burma 5 months earlier. Now there were 130, not 130 killed, 130 still standing, still combat effective, out of the entire original force. The rest were dead, evacuated with wounds, or so consumed by disease that they could no longer walk. This was Merrill's Marauders, the only American ground combat unit to fight the Japanese on the continent of Asia in World War II. And their story is not really about the battles they won. It's about what it cost to fight a war in a place where the jungle itself was trying just as hard to kill you as the enemy was. The unit's official name was the 5307th Composite Unit, Provisional, a deliberately bland, forgettable designation for what was actually America's first long-range penetration force, modeled directly on the British Chindits, the deep jungle raiding columns pioneered by the eccentric and brilliant British General Orde Wingate. In late 1943, roughly 3,000 American volunteers were recruited for what the Army's own paperwork described only as a dangerous and hazardous mission. The call for volunteers reportedly went out under the personal authority of President Roosevelt himself, lending the recruitment an unusual weight for men used to simply following whatever orders came down through the normal chain of command. Many of them were combat veterans already, men who had survived Guadalcanal and other Pacific Island campaigns and volunteered anyway, not fully knowing what they were signing up for. What they got was a mission to march deep behind Japanese lines in northern Burma, cut off from conventional supply, and open a path for the construction of a new overland route to China, a route the Allies desperately needed after the original Burma Road had been severed by the Japanese invasion. Their commander was Brigadier General Frank Merrill, and it was an American newspaper reporter, not the Army, who gave the unit the name that stuck, Merrill's Marauders. Under General Joseph Vinegar Joe Stilwell, the notoriously blunt and demanding American commander in the China-Burma-India theater, the Marauders trained through the end of 1943 at a camp near Deoghar, India, organized into 6 self-contained combat teams, each built to operate independently deep in territory with no roads, no railways, and almost no infrastructure of any kind. Their transport wasn't trucks. It was mules. Pack animals were the only thing capable of carrying supplies and ammunition through terrain this brutal. They crossed into Burma in February 1944, and what followed was, by any reasonable military standard, one of the most punishing campaigns any American unit fought in the entire war. Over the following months, the Marauders advanced roughly 800 miles through some of the densest, most disease-ridden jungle terrain on Earth, fighting 5 major engagements: Walaubum, Shaduzup, Inkangatang, Napumga, and finally Myitkyina, along with more than 30 smaller skirmishes against the veteran soldiers of the Japanese 18th Division, one of the more experienced formations in the Imperial Japanese Army. Their first mission set the pattern for everything that followed. Roughly 2,750 Marauders marched out in late February 1944, and by the time they'd fought their way to Walaubum and helped force a Japanese withdrawal on March 7th, the force was already down to around 2,500 men, a 9% loss before the campaign was even a month old, and before the worst fighting had even started. Their second mission, through March and into April, cost another 67 men killed and 379 more evacuated as wounded or too sick to continue, reducing the unit to roughly 2,000. Then came Npomga, a battle that had nothing to do with the Marauders' original mission of hit-and-run, long-range penetration warfare. General Stilwell ordered them into a static defensive position at Npomga to block a Japanese counterattack, a purely conventional stand-and-hold fight the unit had never been trained or equipped for. They held it anyway, For over a week, surrounded and cut off from resupply, fighting off repeated Japanese assaults with dwindling ammunition until relief finally arrived. It was, by the account of the unit's own officers, the single worst stretch of the entire campaign. Men who had already marched hundreds of miles through disease and combat, now being asked to dig in and take everything a determined Japanese assault could throw at them with nowhere to retreat to. The terrain alone would have broken most units without a single shot being fired. Marauders waded chest-deep through rivers, hacked through walls of bamboo, and climbed mountain trails so steep that mules occasionally lost their footing and fell to their deaths with their loads still strapped to their backs. Rain during the monsoon season didn't just make the ground miserable, it turned the entire theater into a breeding ground for some of the worst tropical diseases in the world. Scrub typhus, an often fatal illness spread by mite bites in tall grass, was reportedly more concentrated in the area around their final objective than almost anywhere else the U.S. Army fought during the entire war. Malaria was constant. So was amoebic dysentery, which could reduce a healthy man to a shadow of himself within days. Leeches caused open sores. The men called them naga sores, that got infected in the heat and damp before they had any chance to heal. For most of an 80-day stretch of the campaign, the Marauders survived almost entirely on K rations, a compact field ration never designed to sustain men through months of continuous jungle combat, and the nutritional toll compounded everything else working against them. Men who had survived Japanese ambushes were, with real frequency, carried out on stretchers a week later, not from a bullet wound, but from a fever that wouldn't break. By the time the Marauders reached the base of the Kumon mountain range in May 1944, the final barrier before their ultimate objective, the Japanese-held town of Myitkyina and its critical all-weather airfield, the unit had already been reduced from roughly 2,750 men who'd entered combat to something closer to 1,400. Each of the unit's 6 combat teams carried an assigned Nisei interpreter, second-generation Japanese-American soldiers, several trained at the Army's Military Intelligence Service language school, who translated captured documents and interrogated prisoners even while serving in a theater where their own government had interned members of their extended families back home. And Stilwell's plan for taking Myitkyina required the exhausted survivors to do something that sounds almost unreasonable to describe: march 62 miles over a 2,000-meter mountain range, using mules to haul what supplies they had left, to launch a surprise attack on an airfield nobody expected them to reach at all. Of the roughly 700 pack animals the unit had started the campaign with, mules and Australian whaler horses brought in after a ship carrying replacement mules was torpedoed en route, only a small fraction survived to reach Myitkyina at all, worn down by the same terrain, heat, and starvation that was wearing down the men leading them. They made it. On May 17, 1944, roughly 1,300 surviving Marauders, alongside Chinese regiments fighting as part of the same offensive, struck the Myitkyina Airfield in a complete surprise. The assault worked exactly as planned. The airfield fell in hours, one of the cleanest tactical victories of the entire campaign. But the town of Myitkyina itself was a different story. Allied intelligence had badly underestimated the size of the Japanese garrison actually defending it. Instead of a lightly held outpost, the Marauders and their Chinese allies found themselves facing a reinforced garrison of roughly 4,600 determined Japanese defenders, dug in and ready to fight for every street. What should have been the final push of the campaign instead became a siege that dragged on for more than 2 months, through the worst of the monsoon season, with the exhausted, disease-ravaged Marauders still expected to hold the line alongside fresher Chinese troops. The unit was, by this point, effectively out of reserves. Desperate for bodies to hold the siege lines, commanders sent requests back to hospitals in India for any convalescing Marauder well enough to be flown back in. Roughly 200 men answered that call, and about 50 of them were judged too weak to fight even by the standards of a unit this depleted and had to be sent straight back. Fresh replacements newly arrived in India, some with barely any jungle training at all, were rushed in by air to fill gaps in the line. A small K-9 detachment, scout and messenger dogs, largely forgotten today compared to their better publicized counterparts fighting in the Pacific Islands theater, also joined the siege lines at Myitkyina, doing largely unheralded work in a campaign already overflowing with unheralded sacrifice. General Merrill himself suffered a heart attack during this period and initially refused evacuation, continuing to direct operations before malaria finally forced him out of the field entirely. Reinforcements, including men pulled straight out of hospital beds in India, some barely fit enough to be sent back, were rushed in just to keep the siege lines from collapsing. The Japanese garrison commander, General Genzu Mizukami, held out until the beginning of August, having already lost the bulk of his heavier weapons and much of his own force to the grinding 2-month fight. On August 1st, with his position hopeless and no possibility of relief, he took his own life rather than surrender. The following night, the surviving Japanese defenders began slipping out of the town, some escaping downriver on makeshift rafts under cover of darkness, wounded men lashed to floating debris in a final desperate bid to avoid capture. On August 3, 1944, Allied forces finally secured Myitkyina. 187 Japanese soldiers taken prisoner and something close to 3,800 killed in the town's defense, out of a garrison Allied intelligence had originally, catastrophically, underestimated. The cost of that victory, tallied a week later when the 5,307th was formally disbanded on August 10th, is almost hard to process. Of the original 2,997 men who had made up the unit, only 130 were still classified as combat effective. Of the roughly 2,750 who had actually entered Burma at the start of the campaign, only 2 men, 2 out of nearly 3,000, had gone the entire campaign without being hospitalized for a wound or a major illness. It amounted to a casualty rate above 80%, inflicted by a combination of enemy action and disease that, by the campaign's end, was killing and disabling more Marauders than Japanese bullets were. None of the roughly 700 horses the unit had started with survived the campaign, and only a small handful of the mules that had carried their supplies the entire 800 miles made it to the end still able to work. An Army Inspector General's report on the unit's condition by the campaign's end used a phrase that says more than any casualty statistic could. It described an almost complete breakdown of morale in the major portion of the unit. That wasn't a criticism of the men's courage. It was a description of what happens to any human body and mind pushed this far past reasonable limits, for this long, with no real hope of relief. Colonel Charles Hunter, the unit's second-ranking officer for much of the campaign, felt for the rest of his life that the Marauders had been badly misused. Pushed past the point, any long-range penetration force should reasonably have been asked to go, then thrown into conventional siege warfare they were never trained or equipped for on top of everything else. And yet, in the years since, the Marauders have never been remembered as broken men. Every soldier in the unit was awarded the Bronze Star for the campaign. The 5,307th received a Distinguished Unit Citation, one of the Army's highest honors for collective valor. Decades later, the modern 75th Ranger Regiment adopted elements of the Marauders' insignia and unit colors directly into its own heraldry, formally tracing part of its lineage back to this unit, recognizing the Marauders as spiritual ancestors of the modern American Ranger tradition of long-range, deep-penetration combat. One of the last surviving Marauders, Sam Wilson, summed up what it felt like to be inside that mission in 3 words that have stuck with historians ever since. We were expendable. He wasn't exaggerating, and he wasn't complaining. Decades later, Wilson would recall how difficult it was simply to keep moving forward as the unit wore down and its numbers steadily decreased around him, a description that says as much about the campaign's psychological toll as any casualty figure could. When Colonel Charles Hunter, one of the unit's senior officers, was briefed on the mission back in September 1943, he was told to expect casualty rates as high as 85% before the operation even began. The Army knew going in roughly what this mission was going to cost. The men who volunteered for it went anyway. Merrill's Marauders captured an airfield that shortened the Allied aerial supply line to China and helped keep a crucial ally in the war. They did it by marching 800 miles through terrain that very few military units in history have ever been asked to cross, fighting a battle-hardened enemy division the entire way, while disease killed and disabled them faster than combat did. It is one of the most punishing campaigns any American unit endured in the Second World War, and one of the least remembered, mostly because there was no single dramatic battle, no iconic photograph, just months of grinding, brutal endurance that eventually broke almost every man who lived through it. Winston Churchill, hearing accounts of the campaign secondhand, called the terrain the Marauders fought through the most forbidding fighting country imaginable. General George Marshall, the Army's own Chief of Staff, called their mission one of the most difficult of the entire war, waged with fewer resources against larger numbers of the enemy than any other American operation in any theater. It deserves to be remembered as exactly what those two men described, not a glorious victory, but a genuinely extraordinary feat of human endurance, paid for at a cost that should never be minimized. If you want to see what happened to the men who survived Myitkyina and came home, that's a story for another video. Let us know in the comments which forgotten battle we should cover next.